For decades, America prided itself on being the land of opportunity, the place where dreams came true. But that's a thing of the past. Today, all you can see is mass deportation plans, border shutdowns, visa restrictions. The United States isn't just tightening immigration, it's declaring an all-out war on it. What happened to the country that once said, "Give me your tired, you're poor"? Why is the nation built by immigrants suddenly changing course? Let's rewind for a second. America has always had a complicated relationship with immigration, but for the most of modern history, the story was pretty consistent. Immigrants came, they worked, they built stuff, they became American. It was the promise that made America, well, America. Ronald Reagan gave amnesty to 3 million undocumented immigrants in 1986. George W. Bush pushed comprehensive immigration reform. Even Barack Obama, who deported more people than any president before him, still created DACA to protect kids brought here illegally. The bipartisan consensus was clear. Immigration was mostly good, we just needed to manage it better. But somewhere between then and now, that consensus completely shattered. And I'm not talking about the usual political theater we see every election cycle. I'm talking about a fundamental shift in how Americans view immigration itself. The land of opportunity is having an identity crisis, and the consequences are spilling across every state, every community, every dinner table conversation in America. So, what broke? What turned immigration from one of America's greatest strengths into its most divisive weakness? Between October 2019 and June 2024, US Border Patrol encountered nearly 11 million unauthorized migrants trying to enter the country. 11 million. That's roughly the entire population of North Carolina trying to cross the border in just 5 years. In December 2023 alone, border officials encountered over 370,000 people. That's more than 12,000 people every single day, or 8 people every minute, around the clock. It wasn't just a surge, it was a tsunami. The numbers were staggering. But here's what made it different from previous waves: the sheer volume and the complete mismatch between arrivals and processing capacity. Immigration courts, which were already backed up, suddenly had over 3.7 million pending cases by the end of 2024. That's triple what it was in 2019. Judges are drowning with average caseloads of 5,000 cases each. Some asylum seekers are waiting over 6 years just for their first hearing. Border towns like El Paso, McAllen, and Brownsville became pressure cookers. But the problem didn't stay at the border. Governors like Greg Abbott in Texas started busing undocumented migrants to cities like New York, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. Suddenly, the border crisis became everyone's crisis. And that's when liberal America discovered something uncomfortable. Good intentions don't pay for hotel rooms. Politics is downstream from reality, and the reality was hitting hard. By 2024, immigration had become the #1 issue for voters, more important than the economy, more divisive than abortion, more urgent than any of the conflicts raging across the globe. Donald Trump doubled down on immigration like his political life depended on it, and honestly, it did. His promise to carry out the largest domestic deportation operation in American history wasn't just campaign rhetoric. It was a direct response to what millions of Americans were seeing and feeling in their communities. Even Democrats started shifting right on immigration. Joe Biden, who campaigned on being the anti-Trump on immigration, ended up implementing some of the toughest asylum restrictions in decades. In June 2024, his administration essentially shut down asylum processing when border encounters got too high. The same Joe Biden who once called Trump's border policies inhumane. But this policy was too late, and criminal smuggling organizations simply adjusted and only allowed enough people to cross without triggering the processing shutdown. Public opinion followed the shift. Gallup polling showed that by 2024, 55% of Americans wanted immigration decreased, the highest level in nearly 2 decades. Even in traditionally liberal cities, support for restrictions was growing. This wasn't just about Republicans anymore. The entire political center of gravity had moved. But if the politics were shifting, what was driving that shift? What were Americans actually experiencing? Wait, if you're finding this interesting, good, that's the point. We cut through the noise and show how politics really shapes your life. Want to stay ahead on the stories that matter? Crime, economics, and why even liberal cities are shifting? Hit subscribe. Alright, back to the video. While the data consistently shows that immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, commit crimes at lower rates than native-born Americans, with a Stanford study looking at 150 years of data, finding that immigrants today are 60% less likely to be incarcerated than people born in the US. But politics isn't about data. It's about perception, and the perception was being shaped by high-profile cases that dominated headlines. The murders of Laken Riley, a 22-year-old nursing student, and Jocelyn Nungere, a 12-year-old child, both by undocumented Venezuelan immigrants let in by the Biden administration, became a rallying cry for immigration restrictions. Stories about MS-13 gang members, Venezuelan gang activity in apartment complexes, and violent crimes committed by recent arrivals filled news cycles. The reality is complex, but the narrative was simple. More immigrants equals more danger. Social media amplified every incident, every arrest, every tragic story. The algorithm doesn't care about statistical significance, it cares about engagement. And nothing drives engagement quite like fear. But even if the crime fears were overblown, there was another problem that was very real: the money. See, America needs immigrants, like desperately needs them. The US birth rate is below replacement level and has been for years. Without immigration, the American workforce would be shrinking just as baby boomers retire in massive numbers. Immigrants fill critical roles across the economy. About 40% of farm workers are undocumented, 1 in 5 construction workers. They're overrepresented in healthcare, food service, and hospitality. During the pandemic, many of them were essential workers. The tech industry? Forget about it. Without immigrants, Silicon Valley would collapse overnight. But here's the economic paradox that's driving so much resentment. While immigrants contribute enormously to the economy overall, their immediate fiscal impact can be negative, especially at the local level. Undocumented immigrants often work in cash economies or use fake or stolen social security numbers, meaning they may not pay income taxes but still use public services like emergency rooms and schools. The Congressional Budget Office estimated that undocumented immigrants contribute about $12 billion annually in state and local taxes, but the cost of services they use, especially education and emergency healthcare, vastly exceeds that number, especially in high immigration areas. It's a classic case where the benefits are broadly distributed, but the costs are locally concentrated. And nowhere was this concentration more visible than in America's biggest cities. New York City spent $4.2 billion in fiscal year 2024 alone on migrant services. $4.2 billion. That's more than the entire budgets of some states. Chicago expects to spend over $275 million. Even smaller cities like Denver are looking at costs of $24 million and climbing. Mayor Eric Adams of New York City, a Democrat who once welcomed immigrants with open arms, started sounding like a border hawk. "Our compassion is limitless, but our resources are not," he said while implementing budget cuts and hiring freezes. The same Eric Adams who campaigned on being a sanctuary city mayor. Schools in immigrant-heavy districts suddenly had to hire Spanish-speaking teachers they couldn't afford. Hospital emergency rooms became de facto immigration processing centers. Homeless shelters designed for local populations were overflowing with asylum seekers who couldn't legally work while waiting for their cases to be processed. The cruelest irony is that many of these cities had declared themselves sanctuary cities, places that would protect immigrants from federal enforcement. But when Texas Governor Greg Abbott called their bluff and started busing migrants directly to their doorstep, the noble rhetoric crashed into fiscal reality. Chicago started housing migrants in police stations. New York opened tent cities. Denver talked about limiting services. The American immigration system had effectively become a shell game, where the federal government sets policy, but local governments pay the bill. And that's when the political class decided enough was enough. What we're witnessing now isn't just policy adjustment, it's a complete philosophical reversal. The Trump administration returned to office with a mandate for the most aggressive immigration enforcement in American history. By February 2025, border encounters had fallen to historic lows, just 8,300 apprehensions, the lowest since 2000. But that wasn't enough. ICE arrests, mass raids, military-assisted deportation flights, and the revival of family detention centers were just the beginning. Then came Alligator Alcatraz. Deep in the Florida Everglades, less than 50 miles from Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort, workers transformed an abandoned airport runway into a makeshift tent city designed to hold up to 3,000 migrants. The nickname was coined by Florida's Attorney General, who boasted that if anyone escaped, there's not much waiting for them other than alligators and pythons. The optics are intentionally harsh. Migrants housed in FEMA trailers and soft-sided tents in sweltering heat, surrounded by one of America's most dangerous ecosystems. Critics called it engineered to enact suffering. Supporters called it secure and cost-effective. Both sides had a point. The administration shut down the CBP One app that allowed migrants to request asylum appointments. They terminated temporary protected status for over 1 million people who entered illegally, but were given legal status by the Biden administration. Work visa applications became harder to approve. Even legal immigrants faced increased scrutiny and delays. But it goes beyond enforcement. Congress appropriated $170 billion in additional funding for immigration enforcement, more than most foreign militaries. ICE became the most funded federal law enforcement agency in history. The message was clear. America was losing the door, and it was closing hard. But here's the question that's keeping policy experts up at night. What kind of country is America becoming? This isn't just about borders or budgets or even votes. This is about America's soul. For 250 years, immigration has been the secret source of American success. America has become the place where the world's ambitious, desperate, and hopeful came to reinvent themselves. It's literally what made the US exceptional. But exceptional doesn't mean easy. The current system is genuinely broken. When it takes 6 years to get an asylum hearing, when cities go bankrupt housing people who can't legally work, when public opinion turns against immigration because the process appears chaotic and unfair, that's a system failure, not a moral failure. The real tragedy is that we're treating this as a zero-sum game. Either we're compassionate or we're secure. Either we're pro-immigrant or pro-American worker. Either we have open borders or we have mass deportations. But the smart money says the future belongs to countries that figure out how to be both welcoming and selective, how to attract the talent they need while maintaining public support, how to be generous without being naive. The question isn't whether America will continue to be shaped by immigration. It will, because demographics is destiny and the global economy demands mobility. The question is whether America will shape that immigration intelligently or let it shape us chaotically. So, here we are, America, the nation of immigrants, at war with immigration itself. The country that once promised opportunity to the world's tired and poor, now asking whether it has room for anyone at all. Immigration built America, but right now, it might also be what tears it apart. The numbers are staggering, the costs are real, the politics are toxic, and the human stakes couldn't be higher. What do you think? Should America double down on the crackdown, or is there a smarter path forward? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more deep dives on policies and power plays shaping your future, hit that subscribe button. I've been your host Nick, thank you for watching.
Back in 2022, Australia made a decision that changed the country forever. After 2 years of having some of the world's strictest border controls during COVID, they threw the gates wide open. In a single year, 536,000 people flooded into Australia. That's like adding the entire population of Tasmania in just 12 months. And it happened to a country that already had one of the world's highest immigration rates per capita. But the curious thing is that this wasn't some refugee crisis or humanitarian emergency. This was a deliberate policy choice by the Australian government. Fast forward to 2025, and something quite different has happened. The same Australians who once prided themselves on being one of the world's most successful multicultural societies are now marching in the streets demanding immigration cuts. Over 54,000 people gathered across every major city in coordinated protests. So, what the hell happened? How did Australia go from immigration success story to immigration crisis in just 3 years? And why are ordinary Australians suddenly rejecting the very thing their country was built on? Well, this is how even the world's most successful immigration nation can reach a breaking point. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to the beginning. In 1945, Australia had 7.4 million people, and the government was terrified. World War II had just shown how vulnerable a sparsely populated continent could be, sitting right next to the world's most populous region. The solution? Immigration. Lots of it. Arthur Calwell's Populate or Perish campaign kicked off the most sustained immigration program any country has ever attempted. By 2025, Australia's population had grown to 27.5 million, nearly a four-fold increase in 80 years. But 75% of that growth came from immigration. That basically means that 3 out of every 4 new Australians over the past 8 decades were immigrants or their children. And that's a demographic transformation on a scale that would make even the Roman Empire jealous, because this country didn't just take anyone. They created what became the gold standard of immigration policy, the points system. Launched in 1989, it was beautifully simple. Want to migrate to Australia? You needed points, English skills, education, work experience, age. Everything was scored and ranked. Only the best made it through. The system worked very well. By the 2000s, Australia was consistently ranked as having the world's most successful immigration program. Second-generation immigrants were outperforming native-born Australians in schools. Crime rates among immigrant communities were lower than the general population. Integration was so successful that 85% of Australians agreed multiculturalism had been good for the country. At this point, Australia had cracked the code. They figured out how to take people from every corner of the globe and turn them into Australians. But there's always a catch. And in this case, it was that all of this success happened at relatively moderate levels. Even during the peak years of the Howard government, immigration rarely exceeded 200,000 per year. The infrastructure could cope. Housing was still being built, schools had space, hospitals weren't overwhelmed. The system worked because it was sustainable. But then, everything changed. What started as 68,000 migrants in 1996 became a relentless acceleration that nobody seemed to notice until it was too late. By 2019, net overseas migration had reached 300,000. Already a record. But that was nothing compared to what was coming. See, immigration had become Australia's economic drug of choice. GDP growth, immigration. Labour shortages, immigration. Aging population, more immigration. Politicians loved it because it made the economic numbers look good without requiring difficult reforms or productivity improvements. But there was a problem hiding in plain sight. While total GDP was growing, GDP per capita, the thing that actually matters for living standards, was stagnating. Australia was getting bigger, not richer. The Productivity Commission, Australia's most respected economic institution, tried to warn people. In 2021, they published a damning report showing that the pre-COVID immigration levels were unsustainable. They found that most of the economic benefits from immigration went to the immigrants themselves, not existing Australians. But nobody was listening. The immigration lobby was too powerful, the economic narrative too seductive, and the political incentives too strong. Then, COVID hit. For the first time since World War II, Australia's borders were essentially closed. Net overseas migration went negative, minus 88,800 in 2020 to 2021. For 2 years, Australia got to experience what life was like without mass immigration. And something interesting happened. Wage growth accelerated, youth unemployment plummeted, rental vacancy rates increased, traffic got better, hospital waiting lists shortened. It was like the country could suddenly breathe again. But rather than take this as a sign to recalibrate, the government saw it as a crisis to be fixed. When borders reopened in 2022, they didn't just return immigration to pre-COVID levels, they went nuclear. The Albanese government, determined to make up for lost time, unleashed the largest immigration surge in Australian history, 536,000 people in 2022 to 2023. That's a 2% population increase in a single year, the equivalent of adding a city the size of Canberra every 2 months. To put this in perspective, even Sweden's infamous migration crisis of 2015, the one that reshaped European politics, was smaller as a percentage of population. Australia's 2022 to 23 intake was the largest per capita immigration surge by any developed nation in peacetime history. And this wasn't refugees or humanitarian cases, this was deliberate policy. A huge chunk of this immigration wasn't even permanent residents, it was students. By 2025, Australia was hosting over 720,000 international students, more than double the pre-COVID numbers. Now, on paper, this sounds great. International education was worth $50.5 billion to the Australian economy in 2023 to 2024. Students pay full fees, contribute to the economy, and many go on to become skilled permanent residents. Win, win, win. Except that's not what was happening. What Australia had accidentally created was the world's largest visa factory. Ghost colleges popped up everywhere, offering courses designed not to educate, but to extend visa status. Some vocational courses were 80% international students who openly admitted they'd chosen their courses based on visa requirements, not learning outcomes. The course hopping phenomenon exploded. Students would start at a legitimate university, then switch to a cheaper vocational course to extend their stay, then switch again and again. One student could cycle through multiple institutions and qualifications, all while working in Australia and competing for housing with locals. Concurrent enrollments, students switching courses to game the system, increased 70% in just 2 years. By 2023, there were 17,000 course-hopping cases in just 6 months, compared to 10,500 total in the 4 years before COVID. This education was more like immigration with extra steps, and the worst part is that everyone knew. Immigration agents were openly advertising courses as visa pathways. Education providers were marketing themselves as the easiest way to stay in Australia. Students were sharing guides on social media about which courses to choose for maximum visa extension opportunities. The whole system had become corrupted, and it was happening at unprecedented scale. And while Australia was busy breaking immigration records, something else was happening. Their infrastructure was falling apart. Australia had spent decades building a country for 24 million people. Hospitals, schools, roads, housing. Everything was designed around that assumption. But suddenly, they had 27.5 million people and counting, with no plan for where they'd live or how they'd be served. The housing crisis hit first and hardest. Australia had historically built around one new home for every new migrant, a sustainable ratio that kept housing affordable. But in 2024, they were building one home for every 2.1 migrants. At the peak crisis in September 2023, it was one home for every 3.2 migrants. The result was predictable and devastating. Sydney house prices hit $1.3 million. Melbourne wasn't far behind. Rental vacancy rates collapsed to historic lows. Young Australians found themselves priced out of entire cities, not because of economic downturns or policy failures, but because their government had imported more people than the country could house. But housing was just the beginning. Hospital waiting lists exploded. The median wait time for planned surgery increased from 36 days to 49 days nationally, with some states hitting 69 days. Emergency departments were overwhelmed. GP appointments became harder to get. Mental health services were stretched beyond breaking point. Schools weren't spared either. Enrollment increased by 45,000 students in a single year, while new school construction lagged far behind. Class sizes increased, resources were stretched, parents found themselves competing for places in their local schools. Even something as basic as traffic got worse. Infrastructure Australia warned that congestion costs, already $19 billion annually, would double to $40 billion by 2031, largely due to population growth outstripping transport investment. The cruel irony is that while Australia was breaking immigration records, their infrastructure investment was actually declining in real terms. The 2024 to 2025 federal infrastructure budget was cut by 3%, representing an $11.7 billion decrease in real terms. Australia was trying to house more people with less housing, educate more children with fewer new schools, and treat more patients with relatively fewer hospital beds. By 2024, ordinary Australians were starting to connect the dots. Why were rentals impossible to find? Immigration. Why were hospital waits getting longer? Immigration. Why was traffic getting worse despite massive road projects? Immigration. Why were their kids struggling to get into local schools? Immigration. The Scanlon Foundation, which had been tracking Australian attitudes towards immigration for decades, recorded the shift in real time. Opposition to current immigration levels jumped from 33% in 2023 to 49% in 2024, and that was before the worst effects had even been felt. But this wasn't racism or xenophobia. The same surveys showed that 85% of Australians still believed multiculturalism had been good for the country. They weren't rejecting immigrants or immigration itself, they were rejecting mass immigration at unsustainable levels. The demographic breakdown was telling. Young Australians, the ones bearing the brunt of the housing unaffordability, were the most opposed to current levels. Only 33% of 18 to 29-year-olds thought immigration was too high, but among those who did, their opposition was intense and growing. Regional Australians, despite receiving almost no immigration themselves, were also turning against the policy. They watched as their children moved to cities for work, only to find themselves priced out by an immigration system that seemed designed to benefit everyone except existing Australians. And then came the protests. August 31st, 2025. Across every major Australian city, something unprecedented happened. Over 54,000 people gathered for coordinated March for Australia protests, the largest anti-immigration demonstrations in the country's modern history. Sydney saw 15,000 protesters. Perth had 10,000. Adelaide matched Sydney with 15,000. Even smaller cities like Hobart and Darwin had significant turnouts. The protesters weren't the usual suspects. These were nurses and teachers, frustrated by overwhelmed services, construction workers who couldn't afford to live in the cities they were helping build, young families pushed out of their neighborhood by rental competition, university students competing with international students for housing and part-time jobs. Their message was simple. Australia's immigration levels were unsustainable, and someone needed to start listening. Counter-protesters organised as well, but their numbers were smaller and their message more diffuse. While anti-immigration protesters had a clear, specific demand, reduce immigration to sustainable levels, pro-immigration voices struggled to address the infrastructure and housing crisis that was driving public concern. The political establishment initially tried to ignore the protests, dismissing them as fringe elements or temporary discontent. But the numbers were too large, the geographic spread too wide, and the demographic diversity too obvious to brush aside. For the first time in decades, immigration had become a mainstream political issue the politicians could no longer avoid. To his credit, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese read the room quickly. Rather than defending the unsustainable status quo, Labour pivoted to position itself as responsive to public concerns while avoiding the harsh rhetoric traditionally associated with immigration restriction. The December 2023 migration strategy represented the most comprehensive immigration reform since the point system was introduced in 1989. Student visa fees more than doubled from $710 to $1,600. Then increased again to $2,000. English requirements jumped from IELTS 5.5 to 6.0. Financial requirements increased to $29,710. The visitor to student visa pathway was closed entirely. This crackdown showed immediate results. Indian student visa applications collapsed by 70%. Philippines applications dropped 85%. Nepal and Vietnam experienced similar declines. University sector leaders warned of revenue losses exceeding $310 million, but public support for the restrictions was overwhelming. Labour also introduced what critics called harsh new anti-migration laws. legislation that would have been controversial under any other government, but passed with broad public support. The laws authorized 1 to 5 year prison sentences for people who resisted deportation, enabled payments to third countries to accept deportees, and expanded ministerial powers to strip refugee status. Most controversially, the laws granted broad search and seizure powers in immigration detention centers and allowed visa bans on entire countries that refused to accept involuntary returns. Human rights groups condemned the legislation as a return to the Pacific Solution era, but polling showed majority support. But here's the thing about immigration: the economics are more complicated than either side wants to admit. On one hand, the pro-immigration lobby was right about the fiscal benefits. Treasury modeling showed that skilled permanent migrants contribute $198,000 more in taxes over their lifetime than they consume in services. That's real money that helps fund schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. The problem was scale and timing. While individual migrants were net contributors, the sheer volume meant that infrastructure investment couldn't keep pace. You might gain $198,000 per migrant over their lifetime, but you needed to spend hundreds of thousands up front on housing, schools, and hospitals to accommodate them. Australia was essentially running a Ponzi scheme, using immigration to boost short-term economic growth while deferring the infrastructure costs to future governments. The chickens were finally coming home to roost. Real capital stock per person, basically the amount of productive infrastructure per Australian, had flatlined. Business investment per capita was stagnating. Productivity growth had fallen to 0.5% annually, half the pre-pandemic average. Australia's economic growth was increasingly hollow, driven by government spending and population increases rather than genuine productivity improvements or business investment. And of course, we can't ignore the issue of social cohesion. Australia had always prided itself on being different from other immigration destinations. While Europe struggled with integration and America battled over border security, Australia had seemingly found the secret sauce for successful multiculturalism. But even that was starting to break down. The Scanlon Foundation's Social Cohesion Index fell to 78 in 2024, down from the 2007 baseline of 100. Cost of living pressures, housing stress, and political polarization all played a role, but the rapid demographic change was clearly a contributing factor. As a clear result, now they have 35% of overseas-born residents from non-English speaking backgrounds reporting discrimination, up from just 9% in 2007. And negative attitudes towards religious minorities are growing, with 34% holding negative views of Muslims, up from 27% in 2023. The cruel paradox was that Australia's integration model was still working brilliantly for individuals. Second-generation immigrants were outperforming Australian-born children in schools. Long-term migrants had higher employment rates and were more likely to hold professional jobs. Language integration was proceeding successfully, with over 95% of established migrant groups reporting English proficiency. But integration takes time, resources, and social bandwidth. When you increase immigration too quickly, even the world's best integration system gets overwhelmed. One of the most politically damaging aspects of Australia's immigration surge was how geographically concentrated it was. Despite extensive government programs to encourage regional settlement, 97% of immigrants ended up in major cities, particularly Sydney and Melbourne. This created a bizarre political dynamic. The regions that received almost no immigration were increasingly opposed to it, while the cities bearing the infrastructure burden were split between those benefiting from immigration, employers, property owners, service providers, and those bearing the costs, renters, young families, public service users. Regional Australians watched as their children moved to cities for opportunities, only to find themselves priced out by an immigration system that seemed designed for urban elites. Meanwhile, urban Australians found their neighbourhoods transformed almost overnight as new arrivals competed for the same housing, schools, and services. The geographic concentration also meant that immigration's benefits were narrowly distributed, while its costs were widely felt. International students might contribute $50 billion to the economy, but most of that money flowed to university administrations, landlords, and businesses in inner-city areas. The broader community saw overcrowded trains, larger hospital waits, and higher rents. That brings us to the current state of affairs. The 2025 federal election delivered a stunning verdict on Australia's immigration experiment. Labour's landslide victory, 94 seats and 62.7% of Parliament, was built on a platform of immigration reform and infrastructure investment. For the first time in 5 elections, Labour was perceived as more aligned with voter preferences on immigration than the coalition. This represented a complete reversal of traditional political dynamics, where Labour was seen as pro-immigration and the coalition as restrictionist. The coalition lost an additional 15 seats, with opposition leader Peter Dutton defeated in his own electorate of Dickson. Voters had clearly decided that rhetorical opposition to immigration wasn't enough. They wanted a government that would actually do something about unsustainable levels. Labour's success came from threading the needle perfectly. They acknowledged that immigration levels had become unsustainable, while avoiding the harsh rhetoric that had made the coalition's position unpalatable to many voters. They promised reduced immigration without abandoning Australia's humanitarian commitments or multicultural values. The election result provided a clear mandate for sustainable immigration policies that balanced economic benefits with social cohesion and infrastructure capacity. But what is even more decisive is that Australia's experiment in mass immigration is over. And what comes next will determine whether the country can preserve what made it special while adapting to the realities of the 21st century. From Australia to the rest of the world, now developed nations everywhere are grappling with the same fundamental question: how much immigration is too much?
After decades of welcoming migrants with open arms, Ireland is now fast-tracking deportations, tightening asylum laws, and facing heated protests over immigration centres in small towns. The shift might seem surprising, especially in a nation whose modern identity is rooted in emigration, not exclusion. From the Great Famine in the 1840s through the 1980s, Ireland lost millions of people to other shores. Its population fell from over 8 million to just 2.8 million in a little more than a century. And today, roughly 70 million people worldwide claim Irish heritage. So how did a country built on the pain of departure become one that's closing its doors? Why is Ireland now declaring war on immigration? For most of its existence as an independent nation, immigration wasn't even on the radar. Ireland's problem was the exact opposite. They couldn't keep people from leaving. We're talking about epic levels of emigration here. From the Great Famine of the 1940s through the 1980s, Ireland hemorrhaged people. The population crashed from over 8 million in 1841 to just 2.8 million by 1961. Entire families packed up and left for America, Britain, Australia, anywhere that offered a shot at a better life. This created what we now know as the massive Irish diaspora. That's why today, an estimated 70 million people worldwide claim Irish heritage. Compare that to the 5.1 million actually living in Ireland. That ratio shows how extensively the Irish scattered across the globe. The reasons were almost always the same: money. While the rest of Western Europe modernized and thrived, Ireland stayed stuck. Poor, rural, and with few prospects, young people felt like they had no real choice but to leave. Farewell parties, known as American wakes, became part of the culture. They were full of tears and final hugs, because leaving often meant never coming back. And I'm telling you this because it matters for understanding what happened next. Over time, Ireland became a country shaped not by those who arrived, but by those who left. Emigration was in the national DNA. People grew up knowing what it meant to say goodbye, to land somewhere unfamiliar with nothing but grit and hope. That collective memory fostered a kind of quiet understanding, an empathy for migrants that would shape how Ireland later handled immigration. Still, even into the 1980s, the country kept losing people. Economic recession hit hard, and over 200,000 people left, most of them young and educated, chasing futures that didn't exist at home. The cycle felt endless. Then came the 1990s, and almost overnight, everything changed. The Celtic Tiger economic boom flipped Ireland's story on its head. In just 15 years, it went from one of Europe's poorest countries to one of its wealthiest. EU membership brought in waves of foreign investment, multinational companies set up shop, and for the first time in a long time, there were jobs, and plenty of them. People stopped leaving. In fact, they started coming back. The immigrant generation returned with experience, skills, and savings, but they weren't the only ones arriving. The real turning point came in 2004, when the EU expanded eastward. While most countries worried about being overrun by cheap labor from places like Poland, Latvia, or Lithuania and impose restrictions, Ireland went the other way. Along with the UK and Sweden, it's opened the doors wide. No limits, no delays. Just come in. We need you. It was idealistic, sure, but also deeply practical. Ireland believed in the European project and the freedom to move. But let's be real, they also had a labor shortage. Construction, healthcare, hospitality, factories, every industry needed people, fast. So the response was bigger than anyone expected. Immigration hit a peak of over 150,000 new arrivals in 2007. Polish became the third national language, after English and Irish. Walk down the street in any Irish town, and you'd hear Lithuanian, Latvian, or Romanian like it was always part of the soundscape. By 2022, 1 in 5 people living in Ireland had been born elsewhere. That's over 1 million immigrants in a country of just 5.1 million. To put it in perspective, that's a higher share of foreign-born residents than the United States, a country that built its entire identity around immigration. And here's where the whole thing really starts heating up. But first, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe, as it helps the channel more than you think. Now, back to the video. For years, asylum applications to Ireland remained pretty manageable. We're talking modest numbers that the system could handle without breaking a sweat. In 2014, there were just 1,448 applications. The numbers crept up gradually: 2,244 in 2017, 3,673 in 2018, 4,781 in 2019, but nothing that screamed crisis. Then COVID-19 hit and temporarily disrupted everything. Travel restrictions meant asylum applications actually dropped: 1,567 in 2020, 2,659 in 2021. Irish officials probably thought they'd caught a break, maybe even had time to strengthen their systems for whatever came next. They had no idea what was coming. The post-pandemic immigration wave hit Ireland like nothing before. In 2022, asylum applications skyrocketed to over 13,600, a staggering 413% jump from the year before. And it didn't stop there. 2023 held steady with over 13,000 more, keeping the system under pressure. Then 2024 broke every previous record, nearly 18,600 applications. Just 3 years earlier, the number hadn't even cracked 3,000. And it wasn't just the volume, it was the pace. Ireland suddenly had one of the highest asylum application rates in Europe relative to its population, about 3.4 per 1,000 residents. That's more than Germany, France, or Italy, countries far larger and with more established systems to handle this kind of flow. But who was coming? Because that changed too. In 2024, Nigeria jumped to the top of the list, making up nearly a quarter of all asylum claims. That's a massive surge, more than 4 times the number from the previous year. In just the first 8 months of 2024, over 3,300 Nigerians applied for asylum. Other top countries included Algeria, Afghanistan, Somalia, and Georgia. Georgia's case is especially telling. Ireland labelled it a safe country back in 2018, which means applications should be quickly processed and mostly denied. But year after year, Georgians kept coming, suggesting that Ireland's deterrent policies weren't really working as intended. And then there's Ukraine. Since Russia's invasion in early 2022, nearly 105,000 Ukrainians have arrived in Ireland. Unlike other asylum seekers, they were granted special protections under EU rules, access to accommodation and full welfare payments, about €222 per week. Compare that to the €38.80 given to everyone else. The result? A two-tier system that created real political strain. Ukrainians, understandably fleeing a brutal war, got strong support. But others, escaping violence, poverty, or persecution in Africa and the Middle East, were left with scraps. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Another thing impossible to ignore was how people were actually getting into the country. For years, most asylum seekers arrived through Dublin Airport without proper documents. It wasn't ideal, but at least it was predictable. Easy to monitor, easy to process. But in 2024, that flipped. Most people were now applying for asylum directly at the International Protection Office in the city centre, not at airports or ferry terminals, which meant that they were already inside of the country by the time they applied. That pointed to one likely route, through Northern Ireland. The common travel area between Ireland and the UK was built to let Irish and British citizens move freely. It was never designed for asylum seekers to use it as a backdoor into the EU. Former Justice Minister Helen McEntee even claimed that over 80% of new asylum seekers were arriving via Northern Ireland. That's how serious the shift was. Ireland's post-Brexit position, still in the EU but sharing an open land border with the UK, had created a migration puzzle no one was ready for. In one 4-day stretch in May 2024, Gardaí, or the National Police and Security Service of the Republic of Ireland, caught 50 people trying to cross illegally from the UK. By May 20th, they'd flagged 107 people without valid visas in targeted checks. The numbers might sound small, but they marked something new, a kind of unauthorized entry that Ireland hadn't really seen before. And now the once invisible border, so central to peace and cooperation, was quietly becoming a pressure point in the immigration debate. So, how did Ireland go from decades of relatively successful immigration policy to a complete system overload almost overnight? It wasn't one thing, it was a perfect storm. Multiple crises colliding at the worst possible time. It all starts with housing, and to be fair, this one was already out of control long before asylum numbers spiked. Ireland is short at least 212,000 homes, maybe more. Over 40% of young adults between 18 and 34 still live with their parents, not because they want to, but because they simply can't afford to move out. In Dublin, rents have doubled since 2010. It's now one of the most expensive cities in Europe to live in. Now, let's say you're a young Irish person stuck at home, watching the government convert hotels and offices into emergency housing for refugees. Even if you're compassionate, even if you understand why people are fleeing their countries, that kind of contrast becomes politically explosive. When your own housing needs go unmet, it's hard to watch new arrivals get placed into housing immediately. The system itself buckled. In 2021, Ireland was housing around 7,000 asylum seekers. Manageable. But by late 2023, that number had exploded to over 32,000. IPAS, the agency in charge, was scrambling. They were booking up every hotel, repurposing buildings, cutting emergency deals just to keep people off the streets. Small towns felt the shock most. Places with little to no experience handling large-scale immigration suddenly found themselves dealing with hundreds of asylum seekers arriving overnight. Roscrea, a quiet town in Tipperary with a population of just 5,500, saw its only hotel converted into a refugee centre, holding 500 people. No warning, no preparation, just impact. The cost? Massive. By 2023, it was costing the government €84 per asylum seeker per day, over €30,000 per person per year. Multiply that by the tens of thousands, and you're talking hundreds of millions. Critics argued that the money should have been used to fix the housing crisis for citizens, but the problem ran deeper than budgets. Ireland's asylum system just wasn't built for this. Decisions that should have taken months dragged on for years. Some people waited over 5 years just to find out if they could stay. That kind of limbo takes a toll on individuals, on communities, and on trust in the system. Then came November 2023. A horrific stabbing outside a school in Dublin injured several children and their teacher. Within hours, rumors started circulating online, claiming the attacker was an immigrant. The police urged the public not to jump to conclusions, but it was already too late. Far-right groups, many linked to international extremist networks, seized the moment. What began as a protest in Dublin turned into chaos. Riots, burning buses, looted shops, and here's the detail that made it clear: hotels housing migrants were deliberately targeted. That night exposed something deeper. For months, social media had been a breeding ground for conspiracy theories about asylum seekers. Phrases like "Ireland is full" and "How's the Irish first" weren't fringe anymore, they were trending. Public opinion was shifting fast. A Red C poll in mid-2023 showed that 75% of people believed Ireland had taken too many refugees. That number stunned even veteran political analysts. The idea that Ireland's own history of emigration would naturally lead to compassion, that assumption was starting to crack. By the end of 2024, it wasn't just about opinions, it was becoming political. One poll showed that 28% of voters would now consider backing a party with strong anti-immigration views. That's double the figure from just 3 years earlier. In a country where anti-immigration rhetoric used to be fringe, was seen as a major shift. Throughout its history, Ireland hasn't exactly been known for sudden political shifts. This is a country where change usually takes time. But in late 2023 and into 2024, everything about Ireland's approach to immigration flipped fast. And for a country long praised for its humanitarian stance, the changes were not just unexpected, they were radical. It all started in December 2023. The government announced that Ireland could no longer guarantee housing for everyone seeking asylum. That was a first. Suddenly, not everyone was entitled to a bed. Single men in particular were left out. Women, children, and the most vulnerable still had priority, but the rest? They were on their own. As a result, tent cities began appearing across Dublin. Parks turned into makeshift camps, and the imagery of people sleeping rough outside the International Protection Office became a global embarrassment for a nation that had once taken pride in its compassion. Still, the government didn't blink. They pressed forward with a new, harder line. Deportations were ramped up like never before. Cross from Northern Ireland without permission, you could be expelled the same day. In 2024 alone, deportation orders jumped 156%, a number that would have seemed unimaginable just a few years earlier. Meanwhile, Ireland broadened its list of so-called safe countries. Georgia, Albania, South Africa, and several Balkan nations made the cut. That meant applicants from these countries could be rejected in weeks, not months. It was efficient, sure, but critics pointed out that some of those places weren't exactly safe for everyone, especially minorities and political dissidents. Even Ukrainians, who had once been welcomed with open arms, saw their support slashed. From open-ended stays and full welfare rates, they were suddenly told they had 90 days in state housing and just €38.80 a week to live on. The rule applied retroactively to those already living in Ireland, many of whom had begun to settle into new lives. All of this unfolded alongside a political earthquake. For the first time, far-right candidates gained seats in local elections. Anti-immigration independents made gains, especially in areas where refugee centers had opened without local input. And the mainstream parties took notice fast. Even Sinn Féin, historically pro-migrant, began calling for tougher controls. Then immigration checks returned to the Northern Ireland border, something unthinkable just a few years ago, given the sensitivity of the peace process. Gardaí patrolled rural roads, coordinated with bus drivers, and checked IDs. The open, seamless border started to feel a lot less open. And yet, through all the fear and anger, there's one thing no one really wants to talk about: Ireland needs immigrants, desperately. From hospitals and tech firms to farms and construction sites, foreign workers keep the economy running. They pay taxes, fill critical gaps, and often use fewer public services than locals. But the rising cost of housing asylum seekers and a brutal housing crisis has made the politics almost impossible. That leaves Ireland trapped between the economic need for immigration and the growing public backlash against it. But not everyone agrees. Recently, Conor McGregor, one of the biggest names to ever fight in the UFC, has become a vocal critic of Ireland's immigration policies and has publicly expressed his intention to run for the Irish presidency, focusing on an anti-immigration platform. However, he faces several obstacles to becoming a candidate, including the need for a specific number of nominations from Irish Parliament members or local councils, which he has not secured. Many Irish politicians have publicly rejected his potential candidacy. Such an awkward spot to be in. Now you know why Ireland is suddenly cracking down on immigration. So, give the video a like, subscribe for more content, and check out this video YouTube thinks you'll love. Thank you for watching. How long do you have to ignore a problem before it runs for office? Japan, the country that spent decades insisting it didn't need immigrants while its population literally disappeared, is now dealing with something it never saw coming, an actual anti-immigration movement, in a country where only 3% of the population is foreign-born. What's happening? This is Japan, where getting permanent residency is harder than getting into Harvard, and the foreign population just hit a record high of 3.8 million people in a nation of 120 million. And yet, in October 2025, Japanese voters looked at their first female prime minister, Sanai Takaichi, and thought, yeah, the person who wants to crack down on foreigners, that's our person. This is why Japan is suddenly declaring war on immigration. Japan's population is collapsing. In 2024, the number of Japanese nationals fell by 908,574 people. That's the biggest single-year drop on record. The country welcomed just 686,061 newborns, the lowest figure since they started keeping records in 1899, when the population was a fraction of what it is today, and most people were farmers. The working-age population, ages 15 to 64, now makes up only 59% of Japan, way below the global average of 65%. Meanwhile, people over 75 account for 57.3% of everyone aged 65 and older. So, in simpler terms, Japan is turning into a retirement home with a flag. Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba called it a quiet emergency. Former PM Fumio Kishida said Japan was standing on the verge of whether we can continue to function as a society. But why are they freaking out really? It's because Japan's working-age population peaked in 1995 at 87.3 million. By 2024, it had dropped to 73.7 million. That's a 16% decline. And according to projections, it'll fall another 31% by 2060. Unless something changes dramatically, Japan will go from 120 million people today to potentially 87 million by 2060. The old age dependency ratio, basically how many elderly people each working person has to support, has more than doubled from 21% to 49% since 1995. By 2060, it's projected to hit 74%. That means for every 4 working people, there will be 3 retirees. Rural areas are basically turning into ghost towns. The number of abandoned homes has surpassed 4 million. Every year, thousands of elderly people die alone in their homes, a phenomenon called kodokushi, or solitary death. And their bodies aren't discovered for days, weeks, or even months. In the first half of 2024 alone, 37,227 people living alone were found dead at home, with 4,000 bodies not discovered for more than a month. 130 bodies weren't found for at least a year. This is what a democratic collapse looks like from the inside. So, obviously, faced with a population crisis of biblical proportions, Japan would embrace immigration, right? You know, like every other developed country with this problem? No. For decades, Japan's solution to its demographic crisis was basically, what if we just didn't? They tried everything except immigration. Financial incentives for having babies? Check. Subsidized childcare? Sure. Encouraging fathers to take paternity leave? Absolutely. Better work-life balance? Well, they talked about it. The government has thrown money at the problem, planning to increase child-rearing support by about 3.5 trillion yen, or $23 billion annually. They're offering housing subsidies, education support, you name it. None of it worked. The fertility rate kept falling. It dropped below replacement level during the 1973 oil crisis and never recovered. Today, it sits at 1.367, way below the 2.1 needed to maintain population. Some experts say even if Japan somehow magically doubled its birth rate tomorrow, the population would still keep declining for decades because the age structure is so skewed. So, essentially, the only action left is to accept immigrants. So, why haven't they done it? Turns out, Japan has strong concerns about the potential impact of immigrants on the country's social and cultural foundation. They are, quote, linguistic barriers and a sense of ethnic homogeneity. Translation: Japan really likes being Japan, and adding a bunch of non-Japanese people feels like diluting the recipe. So, instead of opening the immigration floodgates like Australia or Canada, Japan did something uniquely Japanese. They created the world's most complicated system for letting people in without actually calling it immigration. In 2018, under former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, Japan passed legislation to bring in 345,000 foreign workers over 5 years. Not immigrants, mind you, workers. Completely different. They expanded the Specified Skilled Worker Program. They reformed the Technical Intern Training Program, which was basically a way to bring in cheap labor while calling it skills transfer, and had become so notorious for worker exploitation that human rights groups were screaming about it. In March 2024, they announced they'd replace it with the New Skill Developing Program, which promises better protections and actual paths to long-term residency. And you know what? It worked. Sort of. By October 2024, Japan had 2.3 million foreign workers, a 12.4% increase from the previous year. That's a record high since they started tracking this data in 2008. The biggest groups were Vietnamese, with 570,000 workers, representing 24.8% of the total, Chinese at 400,000, and Filipinos at 240,000. Myanmar saw a 61% increase, Indonesia at 39.5%, Sri Lanka 33.7%. The foreign population hit 3.77 million in 2024, up 10.5% from the previous year, marking the third consecutive record high. Japan's foreign resident population is growing faster than it has in decades. This is all happening while foreign workers still only represent about 3% of Japan's population. For comparison, the US has about 18% foreign-born population, Canada is around 23%, Australia is 30%. Japan's massive influx of foreigners would barely register as immigration in most developed countries. But in a country where 97% of the population has been Japanese for basically forever, going from 2.2 million to 3.8 million foreigners in a decade feels like a seismic shift. And this is where things get more complicated. Because while the government was quietly letting in more foreign workers, a new political movement was brewing online. Meet Sanseito, the Japanese First Party. If that sounds familiar, it should. They literally copied the slogan from Trump's playbook, complete with admitting they studied far-right movements in the US and Europe. Sanseito was founded in March 2020 by a guy named Sohei Kamiya on YouTube. Not kidding, he started a political party on YouTube. Initially, Kamiya built his base by promoting COVID conspiracy theories and rallying against vaccines and masks, classic populist startup energy. But as the pandemic faded, Sanseito pivoted to something with more staying power: the silent invasion of foreigners. Their platform warns of foreigners buying up the nation's infrastructure, growing fat on stolen welfare, raising crime rates, and dragging down wages for native-born workers. But some say that none of it is true, like objectively false. Ministry of Health, Labour and Welfare statistics show that foreigners account for 3.2% of welfare recipients, almost identical to their 3.1% share of the population. So, they're not exploiting the system, they're using it exactly the rate you'd expect them. Crime? The number of foreign arrested for penal code violations has fallen to 1/3 of what it was less than 2 decades ago. Crime is going down, not up. But facts are boring, and Sanseto's YouTube channel is very entertaining. So voters, especially young men aged 18 to 30, started paying attention. In July 2025, upper house election Sanseto won 14 seats, garnering 12.6% of the national vote, the third highest share of any party. They went from 2 seats to 15 total. For a party that started on YouTube 5 years ago, that's insane. The ruling Liberal Democrat Party, or LDP, which has governed Japan almost continuously since 1955, lost its majority. And where did those votes go? To the far-right populists warning about the silent invasion of people who make up 3% of the population. Which brings us to October 2025 and Sanai Takaichi, Japan's 104th Prime Minister and first female leader. Takaichi is complicated. On one hand, historic achievement, first woman to lead Japan in a country that ranks 118th out of 148 countries in gender equality. On the other hand, she's called the Iron Lady because she literally models herself after Margaret Thatcher, wears blue suits in tribute, and has advocated for traditional gender roles, opposes same-sex marriage, and thinks women should focus on motherhood. Oh, and she's pushed for tighter immigration restrictions throughout her career. Takaichi comes from the conservative wing of the LDP. Her rise happened amid, let's be honest here, an uptick in anti-foreigner sentiment. She tapped into that mood to secure the LDP leadership and the Prime Minister position. Her cabinet includes a brand new position, Minister in charge of a society of well-ordered and harmonious coexistence with foreign nationals. That's a lot of words for immigration cop. The new minister, Kimi Onoda, made her priorities clear immediately. She's looking to work closely with relevant government agencies to enforce stricter measures against unruly foreign residents and to revise the country's insufficient immigration policies. Social media immediately exploded with claims that Takaichi was planning mass deportations. Newsweek had to fact-check viral posts saying she immediately created a ministry for mass deportations because millions of people believed it. There's no evidence of any mass deportation plans, but the rumor tells you everything about the mood. Here's what's actually happening though. Takaichi formed a coalition with the Japan Innovation Party, or JIP, which advocates capping foreign residents at 5% of the population in any municipality, tightening naturalization and residency rules, and banning naturalized citizens from holding public office. The coalition agreement explicitly mentions enhancing the control tower function for foreign resident policy. Experts predict she'll follow the traditional Japanese playbook with US presidents: maximum respect, no public disagreements, subtle policy differences behind closed doors. But there's no denying the optics. Trump meets with Japan's Iron Lady who's tough on immigration. It plays well for both. But there's something no one seems to be paying attention to, and that is that while Japan is cracking down on immigration, their economy is screaming for foreign workers. Japan will need 6.88 million foreign workers by 2040 just to meet its growth targets. That's triple the current number. The Japan International Cooperation Agency isn't making suggestions here, they're doing math. Without those workers, Japan's economy is cooked. The unemployment rate has been below 3% for almost 4 years, one of the lowest in the developed world. That sounds great, until you realize it means there's literally nobody left to hire. Job vacancies are at all-time highs. Nearly half of Japanese businesses relied on employees over 70 in 2022. Manufacturing, agriculture, caregiving, construction, these sectors are desperate for workers. The aging population needs caregivers. The infrastructure needs builders. The farms need hands. But Japan's working-age population is shrinking by hundreds of thousands every year. Real wages have cumulatively declined by 2% from Q1 2021 to Q1 2025. Inflation hit 3.5% in May 2025, the second highest among G7 countries. Cost of living is crushing people, and the government's response to the demographic crisis that's causing all this? crack down on the foreigners who make up 3% of the population. The OECD projects that labor shortages will lower Japan's economic growth by 0.7% annually until 2025, and then 0.9% annually after that. Population aging will adversely affect economic growth, and this isn't speculation. It's already visible in the data. Between 1990 and 2022, Japan's real GDP grew at just 0.8% annually, the second lowest among G7 countries. Japan's public debt stands at approximately $9.3 trillion, or 263% of GDP, the highest debt-to-GDP ratio of any developed nation. The cost of pensions, healthcare, and elderly services is expected to hit 28% of national income by 2025. The country is running out of money to take care of its aging population, while simultaneously shrinking the tax base that funds everything. This is like watching someone drown while refusing to grab the life preserver because it's the wrong color. Oh, and there's another twist to this story. Tourists. Japan saw nearly 37 million foreign visitors in 2024, up 48% from 2023. Tourism brought in massive revenue. Cities like Kyoto and Tokyo were packed, post-pandemic travel restrictions lifted, and everyone wanted to visit Japan. And a lot of Japanese people absolutely hated it. The term over-tourism became a political issue. Complaints about disrespectful behavior from tourists, crowded trains, rising prices in tourist areas. Some Japanese started viewing tourists the same way they viewed foreign workers, as invaders disrupting their way of life. And Sanseito capitalized on this brilliantly. Their platform doesn't just target foreign workers, it targets globalization broadly. Tourism, foreign investment, multinational cooperations, anything that makes Japan less Japanese. It's worth noting that this tourism boom is one of the few things keeping some rural economies alive. But when you're building a populist movement, economic reality is just an inconvenient detail. In reality, everyone in power knows Japan needs immigration. The business community has been screaming about it for years. Economists are unanimous. Even conservative politicians privately admit it. But publicly, nobody wants to be the pro-immigration party. Because Sanseito proved that there are votes in being the anti-immigration party, even when immigration is barely happening. Where's the logic? Japan spent decades building one of the most restrictive immigration systems in the world, successfully keeping its foreign population under 3%, and still managed to trigger an anti-immigration backlash. They did everything right, according to restrictionist logic. Tight borders, limited pathways to citizenship, preference for temporary workers over permanent residents, strong cultural preservation, and they still have a far-right party winning 12.6% of the vote on an anti-immigration platform. It's almost like the backlash isn't exactly about the immigration numbers, it's about economic anxiety, political dysfunction, and people looking for someone to blame. And now they're stuck. They can't admit they need mass immigration because that would be political suicide, but they can't survive without it either. So they'll keep incrementally increasing foreign workers while pretending they're cracking down on immigration, hoping nobody notices the contradiction. This is what happens when you ignore a problem so long that the solution becomes politically impossible.